Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jason Staples, and today we're discussing his article titled, or his contribution titled, Lord, Lord, Jesus as Yahweh in Matthew and Luke. So welcome back to the show, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Glad to have you here. So let's get right into it. When you say that Matthew and Luke identify Yahweh as Lord, do you mean simply just Lord Krios, or do you also mean to say that Matthew and Luke are claiming that Jesus is God, or are they trying to distinguish God and Lord as two separate characters?
I'm not making any of those claims in the article. I'm just observing that in the article, my argument is that when you have the doubled kurios or kurie, the direct address form in Matthew 7 and then in Luke 6, and then there's one other example of that. But when you have that example, or when you have that use of the doubled kurios, this Lord, Lord, that this is a way that the synoptic authors are putting in Jesus' mouth. So Jesus is identifying himself with the divine name, and the way that I make that case is that he is using this doubled form of kurios. Kurios can mean, Lord or master or even sir, that sort of thing in Greek. But one thing that is unusual is the idea of this doubled form, and we only see the doubled form in cases. The only times that doubled form appears in earlier Jewish literature and any other literature in the Greek world. The only other time we see that doubled form is when it's rendering a translation of the divine name Adonai plus the term or the title Adonai. So Adonai, Adonai. This idea, or if you prefer to vocalize the divine name, then that. But the basic idea is that when you see this doubled form, this is a way that in Greek translation, it is a way of designating. When you see this doubled form, it's a way of definitely representing that the divine name is in use. You don't see the doubled Adonai in other cases. And so when Jesus then uses the double Adonai in his self application, when he says many will say to me in that day Adonai, Adonai, or Kyrie, Kyrie, this is a reference to the divine name. This is a way of referencing or of putting the claim to the divine name in these early passages in Matthew and in Luke, and thereby identifying Jesus as one who is rightly called by that name. So that's basically the argument of the article.
Right. That's why I phrased the question in that way, because I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the audience, who most of them most likely did not read the article. So basically, I was trying to ask what you mean by that, what's going on there. So basically, sometimes Matthew and Luke have Jesus expressing himself as Lord, as you just suggested. Does that also seem to jive with a phrase that sometimes appears in the synoptics, Lord of the Sabbath? Because sometimes Jesus seems to be referred to as Lord of the Sabbath. Do you think that phrase could be connected to Jesus expressing himself in the double form of Lord, or do you think there's no relationship there?
Well, I think it's not coincidental that that these uses of the doubled form of Lord appear where they do in Matthew and in Luke. So in Luke 6, this is the first time when Jesus calls himself Lord. It's also sort of at the beginning of his ministry, and then we see lots of figures, and also himself in a couple cases, lots of figures refer to him as Lord through the rest of the Gospel of Luke. Having the doubled form as the first example of that sort of that again, as I said, the term kurios can be used in a variety of different ways. If, however, you lead off the first use in the narrative of this puts it in the doubled form, now it's sort of tilting you in a particular direction, a particular way of understanding how that word should be understood through the rest of, say, the Gospel of Luke or into Acts. The same thing with Matthew, where it first occurs in Matthew 7, and from then on we see a number of references to Jesus as Lord, and that includes Lord of the Sabbath and other things. But we, at that point, really, again, have some indication of how Matthew is sort of hinting that you should be understanding this, that this is not just, a rudimentary sir. This is not just an individual who, is a landholder or something like that. This is a title that is tied to the divine name of the God of Israel, and I think that is something that the synoptic authors are trying to do in situating these uses of this where they do. And of course, then later on we see at the very end of Luke, or at the very end of Matthew, that is, we see Jesus use it one more time, and again in the context of judgment. That they will come and they will say, Lord, Lord, and as the judgment is coming near. So once again, that's kind of giving you a little bit of additional feel for what Matthew is doing with this use of the doubled kurie or kurios.
Does this would it be correct to put to suggest that this could explain other instances, like when Jesus refers to the Israelites as being my people? It's a few times Jesus refers to Israelites as being his people, just as they were God's people in the Old Testament. Is Matthew and Luke, when they refer to Jesus as with the double Lord expression, and with other instances like Lord of the Sabbath, do you see this as some evidence that they're either trying to express Jesus, or could be trying to express Jesus as being inheriting the title of Lord? Or is it possible they could be trying to take it further and claim that no, he actually is the God of Israel? What do you think? What do you think's going on?
Well, I think it's when Jesus refers to my people in that case. I mean, that can be again taken several different ways. I mean, if I refer to my people, I might be referring to people from whatever group I'm a part of, whether that be a nation group or people from my city or whatever. There's a variety of different ways that can be understood. And again, I think the gospel writers are they work in this area of kind of ambiguity. There's a certain amount of fuzziness that's in the gospels and how they do this, where they use something that can be used a couple different ways, and they kind of hint in certain directions, but they don't answer that question in the way that, say, the post-Nicene Christians do, where they're trying to discursively, philosophically, square the circle of, okay, well, what is the relationship exactly of the Son to the Father? Is Jesus, God in a personal, like eternal sense, or is he someone who inherits the name from God? The Gospels don't directly, at least the synoptic Gospels, don't directly get into that, to where there's nowhere where they say, okay, just to be very clear, Jesus is the God of Israel here, and sort of this form. They don't do that. They're making specific points through narrative so that the reader has to kind of fill in what gaps are there. And what they consistently are doing is they're using these things where, like you said, that could be taken a couple different ways. You could say, well, I mean, this is identifying Jesus with the God of Israel. Well, yeah, that could be. It can be read that way, I think. It could also be read as Jesus is the bearer of the divine name, in the same way as, say, the angel of Adonai in Exodus, where I will send my angel before you, and my name is in him. Is the angel of Adonai himself? Is that actually the same entity, or is that a different entity that possesses the name and therefore the authority? Or like, what is the relationship between those? That's a little tricky. Similarly, Moses is made God to Pharaoh and made God to Aaron, and then sort of functions as God to Israel. Once Israel disobeys, he becomes the mediator between the God of Israel and the people, and Moses actually becomes sort of the representation, and he is made as God to the people, essentially. Does that mean that he is Adonai? Well, no. In that case, definitely not. But in some sense, the name rests on him, and the same thing with the high priest. The name rests on the high priest. He becomes a bearer of the name. So it's a little bit fuzzier, and you can look at all of those other examples and say, yeah, there seems to be in the synoptics, there seems to be a working with this precedent of the bearer of the name of Adonai as having the authority of the God of Israel and being identified with the God of Israel in some sense. Though in each of those cases, I think you've got a strong case for saying that it's not exactly the same entity as the God of Israel, even though carrying the same authority and all of that in a sort of reflected way. Now, the question is whether the synoptics are building on that to say all of those are sort of shadows of this other example where not only is this a bearer of the name of the God of Israel, but it's the bearer of the name of the God of Israel because it is exactly the person of the God of Israel. That's a little bit of a different question. And I think even when you get into later Christian theology, there's a lot of discussion about that very question. And I think the reason that there's been so much discussion is because the Gospels don't directly answer that question. I don't think you have a straightforward answer to that. Even in Trinitarian theology, I mean, is again, as I said, is the Son the Father? Well, no, not the same person as the Father, and yet divine and bears the same name. And so again, how does this work within the synoptics? I don't think it's the same exactly as what you get in later Trinitarian theology, but they're definitely working with the kind of within the kind of framework as these other early Jewish conceptions of the one like a son of man who comes with the authority of the Ancient of Days and the angel of Adonai in Exodus and all of this, who bear the name of Adonai and therefore have the authority of Adonai and for all intents and purposes can be treated as the God of Israel in as much as they fully bear that name. So if nothing else, Jesus is, by the synoptics, placed there with no, I don't think there's any question about that once you start to look at what they're doing with the doubled name and all, or with the doubled Kyrie and all of that. I don't think there's much question that that's where they're going. Exactly, theologically speaking, where you go with that from there is a trickier question, I think.
So on top of the ambiguity regarding the usage of the Lord, is it Jesus? Is it God, his Father? Who is it? But the Gospel of Matthew briefly mentions some form of the Trinity, baptizing in the name of God, Jesus, God,
It says
the
the
Son,
Father, the
and the
Son,
Holy
and the Holy
Spirit.
Spirit. It says the
Yeah,
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
and you just mentioned a moment ago. You just talked about the ecumenical councils that were trying to wrestle with this. Do you think that since the time the synoptics were composed, this confused early Christians, and later on they tried to resolve it by saying, well, the Trinity. They redefine the Trinity that you see in Matthew. And they try to say, well, it's not just three people in unity. It's actually they're somehow three different people, but they're also the same person at the same time, and you're not supposed to understand it. Do you think they were trying to answer that question when they created such doctrines?
I think they're definitely working within the context of doing careful exegesis of verses like that in Matthew. And then, of course, similar verses in the Gospel of John where I and the Father are one. Well, what does that exactly mean? I mean, in the Gospel of John, that's clearly a reference to the Shema. I mean, the Gospel of John is working with the Shema throughout. I mean, this whole notion of from the very beginning of the Gospel, in the beginning was was logos, was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos actually was God. Oh, okay. What exactly does that mean? How does that? How is something the same as something else? Are they of the same kind? I mean, this is where you get the question of same substance, ousia, that you get in the ecumenical councils, and they're wrestling with these very things. But in the Gospels, they're working with this in a less directly, sort of discursive philosophical framework, and they're working within a more narrative frame, and they're operating in this early Jewish framework where you have the God of Israel is one. That is a non-negotiable, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That Echad matters, right? Well, but exactly what does that mean? Like, what does the oneness of this God of Israel entail? And then when you start to read the narratives and you say, oh, well, the God of Israel is one, but then this one is carrying his name. And then you've got the God of Israel refers to himself in the third person as Adonai and as El. And then, okay. So the Gospels are engaged in, I think, careful exegesis of earlier materials, and the later councils are working with the Gospels. And like I said, that very verse of baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in Matthew, the I and the Father are one, and these various things in the Gospel of John. Before Abraham was, I am. These things in the Gospel of John, and they're trying to again square that circle and try to nail down creedal statements of exactly how these things work out. And I think the gospel writers are not quite ready to try to nail down statements exactly like that. What they're confident of is that, and what they're trying to get across, I think pretty clearly, is that Jesus of Nazareth is to be identified as bearer of the name of the God of Israel. Exactly what that entails in terms of ousia and all of these other things is a little bit trickier question. But for them, following the God of Israel means following Jesus, and I think that's pretty much where the Gospels sort of go with that.
Do you think that the Gospel of John, in some way, is trying to? I get it. You just mentioned that I and the Father are one is also in itself just as ambiguous as Jesus referring to himself with the double Lord expression. But does it seem to be the Gospel of John, or even Revelation, is trying to take things extra to the extra mile when Jesus says something like in Revelation, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end"?
I don't think so. I mean,
Mm.
even in Revelation, you have this thing of Jesus sends his angel to John, and then John falls down at his feet to worship, and he's told, no, stand up. Don't do this. And you have a distinction between the one who sits on the throne and then the Lamb who shares his throne. That looks an awful lot like a lot of other early Jewish literature. I mean, you read the similitudes of Enoch and some of these other examples of what is often referred to as the two powers in heaven idea that you get in early Judaism, and it looks an awful lot like that. So and the same thing in the Gospel of John, where in the Gospel of John you do have this notion of the Logos is Jesus is the Logos, and the Logos is eternal. But the Logos is with God and is God, but is also in some sense distinct from God. And in that the Logos becomes, God is, the Logos is and becomes. And, this is all a part of this larger philosophical discourse that's going on in the Hellenistic world at this point, in the Roman world, about, well, if you've got an eternal being, if you've got a being that is perfect and eternal, how can it do anything, right? I mean, there's a certain point at which, if it's eternal, and eternity is like a fixed moment in which there's all that there ever will be or was, and all of that sort of in one thing, then if the eternal does something, then that means that thing wasn't at one point. Now you have a break in eternity, which you can't have. And so this is a philosophical problem, right? This is, how do you get to where you can have the eternal that isn't just like fixed and stable to where nothing ever happens. Like, you can't have something happen in eternity, because happening implies passage of time, at least as far as we can understand it, and in our experience. And so you have a lot of this discussion of, okay, well, you've got the realm of being, where, you know, the one God, or, you know, if you want to get into later Neoplatonism, the one, or the being, if you want to use more philo language here. The essence of being is in that this existence sphere of things, but we live in a, you know, material world of becoming, where we never actually truly are in a fixed sense. How do you bridge that gap? Well, one way of doing it is to talk about, like the Neoplatonists talk about emanation, where the one eternally emanates by the one's very nature. So it is perpetually, eternally, it's doing in an emanation sense. It's spilling out of its, you know, completeness into something other than itself, and that is an eternal act, so that, you know, what is happening in becoming is actually happening in eternity, but it's not as though it's actually separate moments for that one. And the emanation is in some of this Greek philosophical material is identified with the logos, right? So the logos is the eternal principle that of by which everything is brought into being by becoming. So it's kind of like the bridge between the eternal being and the realm of becoming, and it is this in an eternal sense. So what the Gospel of John does is it basically argues that Jesus is the full manifestation of this eternal logos, which is both becoming and being wrapped into one. It's this resolution of all paradoxes in the person of Jesus. That's what John is doing. And that actually does seem to differentiate Jesus as logos, who is also theos in some sense, but from theos in another sense, right? So there is a little bit of a distinction there. And again, this is all trying to work out some of these paradoxes that are central to our existence. I mean, this is something that today in modern science we have a serious problem of, like, how do we exist? How is it that we, you know, there's like conscious beings that actually that we're having this conversation? How does this? There seems to be a contradiction in the fact that we even exist at all. And this is all part of that. And again, the Gospels are I think more sophisticated than a lot of people appreciate in their attempts to reckon with this very question, and they are highlighting Jesus of Nazareth as central to answering this question, and they identify him with, like I said, with the divine name, and through the divine name with the highest God, the God of Israel.
Do we have any surviving evidence, or even later Christian commentaries that may have cited lost texts that may have given us an inkling of how early Christians dealt with the Gospels around, or just after they were written down, how they tried to wrestle with this and how they interpreted the double expression of Lord, and how they view Jesus's relationship to God. Do we have any evidence of what they thought, or does it just not survive?
So let me just to clarify your question. Are you asking? So do we have evidence of how early Christians are understanding this double kurios?
Yes, that's my question.
Okay. We do. I think we do fairly obviously, actually, and that is in that the earliest Christians pretty much universally identify Jesus as someone to be worshipped, and identify him with the embodiment of the God of Israel in some sense. Now, again, there's a lot of debates among early Christians about exactly how that should be understood, sort of in a more careful philosophical framework. But, you know, aside from someone like Marcion, who has the idea that Jesus is a representative of another God who overcomes the God of Israel, which, you know, was not a majority position. I think it's fairly evident that was not a majority position, although there were certain places, I'm sure, where you can make the case that in Edessa and some places like that Marcionite doctrine got there first. By and large, the evidence that we have from the earliest Christians seems to be that they understood Jesus as identified with, in some way, the God of Israel, which means that they're reading this kurios that way. There's not that I can't remember off the top of my head. It's been several years since I worked on this article. Can't remember off the top of my head what any specific commentators did with the double kurios in terms of directly explaining it. I don't know that I don't remember there being any significant commentary on why he uses the doubled form or anything at that point. But at that point, it's sort of taken for granted in early Christianity. I mean, by the time you're getting to the second, third, and fourth centuries, when we're getting this later material, by that point, these early Christian writers are already assuming that when Jesus says Lord, even the singular, that he means that he's identifying himself as divine in this way. So I don't know that they have the same question at that point that you would in the mid first century or mid to late first century when the Gospels are written.
Do you find in the expression of the Son of Man a similar ambiguity, like in Mark 13, for example, when it says that it's talking about the Son of Man coming down from the clouds? In some question, is it trying to say that Jesus is the Son of Man or not the Son of Man? And we see somewhat similar situations in Matthew and Luke. And to add another question attached to that, do you think that ambiguity surrounding the Son of Man could be, in some sense, connected to the double expression of Lord?
So I'll answer the first one first. I do think that Mark and others are identifying Jesus as the Son of Man. Now, you can ask the historical Jesus question of, did Jesus himself understand himself to be the Son of Man? And that's another question. I'm just going to address it on the level of the Gospels. But the Gospel of Mark starts out, one of the first stories of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus healing a paralytic, and then when before he heals this paralytic person, he says your sins are forgiven, and then you've got this whole discourse where the scribes say among themselves, this man blasphemes. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And then Jesus says, what's easier, to say your sins are forgiven or to say rise and walk? But so you will know that the Son of Man has authority in the land, or has authority to forgive sins in the land. I also say rise and walk, and go to your home. And the man gets up and walks. And so Jesus here says, so that you will know the Son of Man has authority, I'm going to do this. Well, I think that's a fairly obvious self-identification of the Son of Man with himself when he says, so you will know the Son of Man will do this, and then he does the thing, that he has authority. Who is the Son of Man? Well, the one who's doing this very thing. But that's typical of Mark, where Jesus uses this terminology, and he uses it in a way that, well, if you want to see it through one lens, Jesus is talking about the Son of Man. But if you just look a little bit closer, Jesus is obviously making that claim to be that. And I think by the time you get to Mark 13 and the late portions of the gospel, Jesus has talked about the Son of Man in this way enough times that you should be able to identify that Jesus is talking about himself, that he is saying that the Son of Man will come in the clouds, and will in all of this. When you get to Mark 15, he says that, or 14 and 15, you get these same references there, where in his response to Caiaphas, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? I am. It's the third I am saying of the Gospel of Mark, and I don't think that's an accident. You have the first one when he walks on the water, the second one, many will come in my name saying I am, and then you have a third I am with no predicate in the Gospel of Mark, and the third one happens to be his response in this trial scenario, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. I mean, I don't think that's especially ambiguous or ambiguous at that point. There's not a ton of ambiguity at that point, even though there's still enough. You can kind of play with it and be like, okay, well, he's talking about the Son of Man coming in the clouds at some future point, but he just said, I am, right? So I think he's doing that there. And actually that latter example, what is it? 1562, I think is the reference there, if I remember right. When he answers Caiaphas, putting together the I am without a predicate along with the Son of Man saying, with this mention of the Son of Man, suggests that Jesus is identifying the Son of Man as the bearer of the name. So yeah, that does seem to connect the Son of Man to the Lord, to the title Lord, that then becomes part of the earliest Christian creed. And that's something else that in this article I get into, is that, the earliest Christian creed that we see in Paul's letters, where the creed is Jesus Kyrios, Jesus is Lord. And, this seems to be what you would confess at baptism or whatever as a part of becoming a part of the believing community. And that, especially if these gospels are written, as we know, the Gospels are coming after Paul's letters. If this is already the early Christian creed, Jesus is Lord, and then you have the Gospels that are talking this way, I think that further illustrates what's going on there. Now, the interesting intertext there is that in Matthew 7, the emphasis is actually not on whether Jesus is Lord. That saying in Matthew 7:21-23 presumes that Jesus is the proper bearer of the name of the double Kyrios. Not everyone who does, but the key there is that he then says, confessing that and believing that is actually not enough. That's the argument of Matthew 7. He says, not everyone who says to me, Kyrie, Kyrie, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So the argument there is that recognizing Jesus' connection to the God of Israel, that he is the proper bearer of the name and all of these things, is insufficient if it's not paired with obedience, with the obedience that is proper to the one who has the rightful authority to dispense and mediate Torah, which Jesus then claims in the Gospel of Matthew. So obedience, doing the things that obeying the one who obeys the will of my Father in heaven, that obedience is actually necessary, and that goes beyond just the simple confession of the identity of who Jesus is.
And in my closing question, you just mentioned Paul a moment ago, and his and in Paul's time and Paul's letters, Jesus is referred to as Lord. And thus, my following question is, in Paul's time, from what we see in his letters, is there evidence of a similar ambiguity that we're seeing in the Gospels? Maybe not on the same level, but close enough. Is Jesus Lord? Is he not Lord? Is he just referring to himself in the same way that God does, but he's not trying to go any further than that? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I don't think there's a whole lot of ambiguity about what Paul means when he says Lord. I mean, I think when he says Lord, he's when he talks about Jesus and identifies him as Lord, he's referring to the name. So Jesus is the bearer of the name, for sure. Now, as to what that means about Jesus in terms of how that pertains to God, is another thing, because Paul, in one place in a careful play on the Shema, says that for us there is only one God. Well, that's pretty typical, right? This is in 1 Corinthians. For us, although there are many gods and many lords, he says, and with respect to the nations, he says, for us there is only one God and one Lord, Jesus. Now, here's the thing: is that identifying God and Jesus as Lord as the same individual person, or is this again a two powers in heaven kind of idea, where you have one God and then one Lord who is actually the sort of regent, or the one through whom that one God rules. And I think for Paul, it seems to be the latter. He over and over again in his greetings, for example, will say, grace and peace to you from the God and Father, from our God and Father, and from our Lord Jesus Christ. These sorts of things are various variations of that, where he seems to differentiate between those two while still treating Jesus as divine, as worthy of worship, as authority, as the one through whom God, Theos, actually rules, but differentiating them at the same time. And so I think he's doing a lot of the same things there. And again, I think this is the sort of thing that later Christian theology is trying to kind of figure out as it's working through these texts in a completely different context, in a context where now you have largely Gentiles who, are not coming out of an early Jewish context. They're not a part of the same world that Paul and the authors of the Gospels are. They're writing within the context of early Judaism. And for them, the way that they're doing this, they're bringing a lot of presumptions in that are from this larger early Jewish tradition. Later on, when you're getting these councils in an almost exclusively Gentile Christian church, they're trying to, again, do very careful exegesis to try to figure out what these earlier figures are doing in a different context, and trying to develop that for their own day. And that's a little bit different. But like I said, I think Paul is doing a lot of the same things in what he's saying and how he's working with this concept as what the synoptics and John, each of them have different ways of doing it and different ways of kind of different angles of working with that, but they're all kind of working within this same early Jewish milieu in terms of how they understand that notion of Jesus as Lord, but not exactly this Lord. And as you get in John, Logos is with God, so he's not exactly God, but he also is God, so he is God. And I think Paul would actually kind of agree with that same way of framing it, and I think that's something, like I said, that first generation of Christians and early second generation of Christians are all kind of working with.
I'm gonna add one more question, kind of related to my previous one. Do you think that Paul is also doing something similar with the Philippians hymn when he talks about Jesus um, coming down in likeness of a man, kind of thing? Like, and some suggest that this is kind of reminiscent of Philo's logos, the way the logos is described. What do you make of that?
So again, to clarify, you're asking when Paul says, when Jesus, this is in Philippians 2, when Jesus comes down in the likeness of human flesh, or in
Right.
Romans 8, the same thing. What exactly are you asking with that?
What do you think Paul means by that? Is he also being sort of okay? I get that you said it earlier, that Paul's not being as ambiguous when he uses the term Lord like the Gospels would later be. But is there ambiguity in the Philippians hymn when he tries to express Jesus becoming a man, or is he still evenly parsing out God and Jesus as he does elsewhere?
Oh, I think there's ambiguity there. And again, this is the whole thing of he does differentiate between Jesus in this context as the one who Jesus is given the name, right? At the end of the Philippians hymn, he is given the name above every name. Well, that means he has the name, right? But that also means that if you're given something, that means that there's at least some point in there where he doesn't have it, right? Now that's a lot. You could argue that that's a logically prior question, not a eternal question. This is the sort of thing that the early church has lots of debates over. But what I think he's doing is he differentiates between the Father in this case and the Son, who becomes he comes in as a a human being, and being found in the form of a human being, he submits himself to death, and after that, through his obedience, he then is given. He receives. Therefore, God has highly exalted him. Therefore, who has highly exalted him? Well, God, separate from him, has highly exalted him, and then given him the name above every name. So now he becomes sort of equal with God in that sense. Though before he did not think equality with God as something to be grasped, now he actually becomes equal with God in that same sense. Having perhaps, I think you can make a case for some notion at the beginning of the Philippians hymn, and again, it's ambiguous. There is he actually equal with God at the beginning of the hymn before emptying himself? And I think you can make a persuasive case for that he's equal with God at the beginning of this. Does not see that as something to be grasped or to be maintained in that way, but empties himself, and then after emptying himself, he is given the name. So there's a sort of both and, a yes and kind of logic to what Paul's doing there, and I think that both and kind of logic is undergirding a lot of the material and across this in early Judaism, or among these early Christians who are working in this world of early Judaism.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jason.
Thank you very much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.